this is the Formula One News Hour, and I'm Jonathan Steele, your host. It's January the 1st, 2023, and we should start off by wishing everybody a Happy New Year and hope the 2023 brings you everything that you're planning and hoping for. It's strange and yet fascinating how fast the years go by. One of the things that you're never prepared for when you're young is just how quickly those years do go by. You're 21 year, you wake up and you're 30, you wake up again, you're 40, and before you know it, you're like me and you've reached your 70s. I'm happy to say that most of my years have been good, they've been exciting with lots of adventures along the way. But let's start this 2023 year by thanking all of our sponsors, the Thinology, Off the Press, Inform America, El American, Give Send Go, and CloudHub. They've been with us since the onset of this podcast, and we're hoping that they'll stay with us as the year 2023 goes on, and we get to actually watching the cars race again, which I know we're all just sitting on pins and needles waiting for. Not a lot in the news this last week or so, actually 2 weeks since we did our last podcast because of the holiday season. But the only news that's out there really is, for some reason, Christian Horner, who's team principal at Red Bull, is a little miffed by the amazing amount of progress that the Mercedes have on their 2023 car. He thinks that there's a little something going on that nobody else was aware of, which of course every Formula One team is trying to keep whatever they're doing secret from all of the other Formula One teams, because that's how they gain their advantages. So anyway, Christian's a little miffed by that. So, but we won't lose too much sleep over that. The other thing, of course, since we spoke, is that Mick Schumacher, of course, did sign up to be the reserve driver for Mercedes. So he will spend his time in the simulator, and occasionally, if one of the Mercedes drivers can't make it, he'll race for them. But also, of course, he'll do the practice sessions and things like that. So it's good to see Mick back in a seat. I'm still baffled by the Haas team's decision to go with a much older driver in Hulken, and we'll see how he fares. So he was out of Formula One for a couple of years. Don't remember the exact amount of time, but it is strange that they've gone to a much older driver like that instead of working with Mick, who will probably not follow in his father's footsteps in winning 7 or 8 world championships, but will follow in his father's footsteps by being a really credible Formula One driver. So anyway, we wish them the best of luck, and we also wish Haas the best of luck with their decisions, because as we brought to you right there at the Coda racetrack back in October, they've got a serious sponsor that helps them with not worrying too much about where they're going to get money from. So this week we're going to talk about Denny Hulme, the Formula One driver from New Zealand, and also we're going to spend the second portion of this news hour really delving in deep to the history of the tires. We've touched briefly on the Formula One tires and some of the idiosyncrasies and stuff like that. But this week we're going to spend a good 20-30 minutes really looking at Formula One tires and their evolution in the history and all things like that. So, but in the beginning, we're going to talk about Denny Hulme. Denny Hulme was a driver from New Zealand. He grew up on a farm in New Zealand, not a sheep farm or anything, but a farm that specialized in produce. He was born on he was born on the 16th of June, 1936, and he died on October the 4th, 1994. A very strange and interesting fact about Denny Hulme's death: he was the first Formula One driver and he was the 7th to die, but he was the first to die of natural causes. Very, very interesting. He also had the same beginnings as a lot of the drivers from that era. But what's interesting about Denny Hulme is that he wasn't a top Formula One driver very long, and it wasn't very long. In fact, just 2 years driving full time in Formula One when he won the World Championship. He was world champion in 1967. So he was in between right after, I would say, rather, John Surtees and Jim Clark and those guys, and right before Graham Hill. So he was a older guy when he got into Formula One. As I've mentioned a lot of times, the drivers from back then really drove a lot of different cars, and probably Denny Hulme was known more for driving saloon cars than he was for driving Formula One cars. In fact, when he got from New Zealand to Europe, and he got there by way of the New Zealand Racing Association promoting him to go with another driver at the time to Europe, as he'd won a couple of the saloon car races in New Zealand, and so they promoted them to go to Europe and develop their skills. What's interesting though is he was always in the shadow of Bruce McLaren, because Bruce McLaren had gone that same path, but maybe 4 or 5 years before him, even though Denny Hulme was actually right about the same age as Bruce McLaren. As I mentioned, he kind of blossomed later, and he, like a lot of the other drivers, he was driving for the Cooper team. Cooper, if you remember rightly, they really were like a test bed or a growth bed for young Formula One drivers. Just about everybody you can think of from back then, with the exception of a few, one being Jackie Stewart and the other being Jim Clark, that didn't really drive for Cooper, but a lot of the other guys did. So when Denny Hulme first got to Europe, in fact, he started off again in doing saloon car races, but also he drove junior Formula and Formula 2 for the Cooper car company. He didn't have a lot of success in the beginning, like everybody else. He other than in saloon car racing, when he moved from saloon car to open wheels, he kind of struggled a little bit, but he quickly learned how to master the open wheel cars. Another interesting thing about Denny Hulme, his nickname was the Bear, and he got this because he was kind of for a Formula One driver, a large, gruff-looking guy, and he also, in his early days of racing, he did not wear driver's shoes. He didn't wear any shoes at all. He used to race in bare feet. And he said he did that because it gave him a better feel for the pedals, which is really, really important. It was a very interesting path that he took there, and that he really spent his time driving with no shoes. This portion of the Formula One News Hour is brought to you by Phenology. All these cars that we talked about a lot punch out a lot of data today, and you need somewhere to store that data, and you need systems to help you manipulate that data. And so Phenology, a data center in Austin, Texas, is one of those places that can do that for you. They can host your websites, help you manage and store your data, help you develop engineering tools from your data, bring your own servers in. They're a co-location site. All the different kinds of things that you would expect from a data center, you will find at Phenology. That is Phenology.com. Again, Phenology.com. So, as we were talking about Denny Hulme, when he went to England, he went to England. In the history books it says Europe, but he actually went to England. He went with a guy called George Lawton, and both he and Lawton at the time were driving in the junior formula programs. And at the end of the first year that they were over there, George Lawton ended up losing a piece of his suspension, a piece called the ball joint, which holds the top of the wheel and the bottom of the wheel housing to the chassis, and that broke, and he lost the control of the car, and of course went head on into a wall. And in a really sad ending to his life, he ended up dying in the arms of Denny Hulme. And that they were, of course, coming from New Zealand. They were good friends, as were the other guys that were from there, especially Bruce McLaren, who of course Denny Hulme ended up driving for. But there was kind of a really sad beginning, we should say, to Denny Hulme's time in Europe. So the other thing that Denny Hulme liked to do was drive really powerful cars. He liked the big V8s, the V12s, and even the BRM V16. He liked those cars. He liked to drive those cars, and a lot of times, the cars are too powerful for the chassis, for the engines, and so of course, in the early days, there were lots of accidents. And not to mention the tire technology was not up to par, and tires were the cause of many deaths in Formula One back then, including the incredibly great Jim Clark. If you remember, he burst and lost a tire and veered off into the trees in Nuremberg. But we'll talk more about that in the tire section. So the very first kind of outings for Denny Hulme in Formula One was met with limited success. What's really interesting about him is that in all of his time in Formula One, he only won one Formula One race. He was world champion in 1967, but he came in second and third and everything so many times but he only ever won once. And he only ever got the pole position once. His Formula One career was really short. It was only over a span of 4 to 5 years. And yet in that 4 to 5 years, like I say, he was very successful. He had a Formula One championship to his name, and he was racing against the best of the best back then. Graham Hill, Jackie Stewart, and Jack Brabham. In fact, he was driving for Jack Brabham when he won his Formula One championship. So essentially, Denny Hulme really only drove for 2 Formula One teams, and that was Jack Brabham. He raced for Jack Brabham starting in 1965. Jack gave him a ride for 1 or 2 races, kind of like a backup, as you would to the main guys, which Jack Brabham himself was one of them, but he had another drive that was his number 2 driver. And so when the number 2 driver couldn't make it for whatever reasons, because a lot of the reasons back then was because they had commitments to drive saloon cars or other kind of cars. Denny Hulme himself, he drove saloon cars, he drove Indy cars, he drove Formula One, Formula 2, Formula 3. So they did the Can-Am cars, and in fact with McLaren, they won a lot of the Can-Am series together, about 4 or 5 years in a row. But so in 1966, Jack Brabham took him on as a full-time driver. So when you think, he hadn't been in Europe but 2 or 3 years, and he'd gone from really an unknown to being the number 2 driver for Brabham, because Jack Brabham himself was number 1. And he did very well that first year. He came in 4th in the World Championship drivers, and although he didn't win a race during that period, he was very close at coming in 2nd and 3rd and stuff like that all the time. So he very much cut his teeth and proved himself that he was a formidable Formula One driver and was a potential champion. And in fact, in 1967, he would win the Monza Grand Prix after both Emerson Fittipaldi and Jackie Stewart dropped out with mechanical problems. So, and his boss, Jack Brabham, also had mechanical problems. He did finish the race. Jack Brabham came in second, but Denny Hulme won that race. And then for the remainder of the year, he came in, second, third, fourth, whatever, and managed to develop enough points that in the end, which was the US, he actually won the championship driving at the US Grand Prix. And he actually came in second in that race, but it was enough for him to win the World Championship. He won the championship by 6 points. So his time at Brabham came to an end in 1967 after winning the championship. He then moved on to the McLaren team in 1968. So he actually drove for McLaren from 1968 through 1974 when he retired. And he not only drove Formula One cars for McLaren, but he drove also in the Can-Am series, which I said he was very, very successful with his boss, Bruce McLaren. And of course, he drove a lot of saloon cars, the most popular of which was a Rover that he won a number of races in. Not a lot of people recognized Rover as a race car. They were fairly bulky looking sedan, but they were beautifully engineered, and they were really a step ahead in the suspension. In the way they had the suspension design. The upper wishbone actually had the shock absorber attached to it, and the shock absorber was horizontal. So it was really, really interesting. And so the Rover cornered beautifully. It would hang into the corners and would really do a really nice job of making it way around the track. During his Formula One time with McLaren, he had limited success, and in fact, 1968 was not a good year. 1969 was even worse. 1970 was a little better. He actually came in fourth in the Drivers' Championships. In 1970, he might have actually made it to second place if it hadn't been for an incident at the Mexican Grand Prix. And what happened there, you've heard me talk about how the Formula One has changed dramatically from the 60s and 70s through to today. When we used to be able to go anywhere on the track. And in fact, we could walk under the track and run across it and stuff like that. And in 1970 at the Mexican Grand Prix, some children were playing chicken with the race cars and trying to decide, trying to see how close they could run across the track in front of the cars without getting hit. And of course, it caused a major accident. There was actually people killed, a couple of racing drivers really badly injured. And so, that started the trend of, we got to keep the spectators off the track. It didn't happen straight away. It kind of went through the 70s. But anyway, it became apparent to Denny Hulme that he was not going to be the Formula One world champion again. And on top of that, he was losing the wake up and the thrill of trying to win and the drive of trying to win every day. And so in 1974, he called it quits from Formula One. Now, he still, throughout his life, continued to race. But after the Formula One, he actually went back to New Zealand. Denny Hulme was in the Le Mans 1966 Le Mans 24-hour race. He was co-driver to Ken Miles. If you ever get the chance to watch the movie Ford versus Ferrari, you'll get a bit of history in that. But Colby, the car manufacturer, had built 4 or 5 Ford specially designed cars to enter into the Le Mans 24-hour race. And so Denny Hulme was driving with Ken Miles, and Bruce McLaren was driving with who else? Chris Amon. Bruce McLaren was driving with Chris Amon, and so Henry Ford had sent down instructions that he wanted the cars to cross the line together, but the idea was that it would be a dead heat. But it's also got to be mentioned that the folks at Ford did not like Ken Miles, and they never wanted him driving their cars. But the builder of the cars, Carroll Shelby, rather, not Colby Shelby. Carroll Shelby insisted on Ken Miles. They had been good friends, but back then the way that they started the races was the cars were lined up along the edge of the tracks, and on the other side of the track, the drivers would run in, jump in the car, bottle them up, and off they'd go. Well, the first car was maybe 200-300 yards further down the track than the last car. And so when they came to the end, when they came to the finish, the people, when they crossed the line, the guys with the timers and everything determined that Ken Miles and Denny Hulme came in second, because they'd actually started off all the way down about 100 yards further down the track. So as they crossed the line, it was determined that Hulme and Ken Miles had in fact not completed the same distance in the race. So they came in second. Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon were then deemed the winners. So this was kind of an interesting point in motor racing. It was also interesting, that Denny Hulme just took it in stride, but for Ken Miles, it was a big slap in the face. I mean, he won. They won unofficially. They won the Le Mans 24-hour race, but they were never given the credit for it. In fact, in all of Ken Miles' life, he always complained that the New Zealand media never gave him the same coverage that they gave to Bruce McLaren. And of course, McLaren was the New Zealand golden boy of that time. I mean, he was not only a brilliant driver, he was a brilliant designer, brilliant builder. I mean, he was everything that you could want to have your country be proud of you. And so even during his death, or not during, but as he died, he still had this chip on his shoulder that he wasn't going to get the credit that he felt like he deserved. The other thing that Denny Hulme did, he came across to the United States to drive in the Indy 500. He was going to be driving the McLaren car, and that was, I think that was 1965. But his hands got burnt when the fuel burst into flames, and as that fuel, when it bursts into flames, it's clear you can't see it, and so he had to sit out that race and nurse his hands back to good health again. So really, the highlight of his motor racing career was, one, winning the Formula One World Championship. Two, though, that he did win the Can-Am series with his boss, Bruce McLaren. He and his wife at the time moved back to New Zealand. They had a baby boy, and he was their only child. And when the boy was 21 years old, he died in a diving accident in New Zealand. And there's a lot of stuff written about how that really got to Denny Hulme. It is often written that they were more like brothers than it was father and son. They were extremely close, did a lot of stuff together. And so when he died, a lot of people say he died more of a broken heart than a heart attack, which is what he died from. He died in a race. He was driving a BMW in a race in New Zealand, and midway through the race, well, midway, it was about lap 3 or 4, he started complaining of vision problems. And then a little later on, he says, I don't know what's going on. I can't see a thing. And so his pit crew assumed that maybe there was some fog or stuff like that on the track, but there was no other drivers complaining about it. Anyway, he slowed down, he grazed along a wall, pulled the car off to the side of the track and killed it, and he died right then. They tried to resuscitate him for 30-40 minutes, but he died right there on the side of the racing track. So actually, for a guy like that and lived a life like that, probably not the worst of places or the worst time to die. Doing what he loved and dying doing what he loved. So anyway, Denny Hulme's right before he died, a couple of years before, the loss of his son ended in his marriage splitting up, and that very often happens in life, especially when couples only have one child, and the child is really, in a lot of ways, being the glue that held the marriage together, which is probably true for a lot of marriages, especially as the children go through that 3-4 year age group all the way through 15-16. The children hold the marriages together, and those of us that are lucky, our marriages stay together after the children go off to college. But I have a lot of friends where they divorced as soon as the children left home. So a kind of sad end to his life in one way. After he left his wife, he moved in with a journalist in Auckland, and that was kind of his home. His wife still owns the family property. They bought around 350 acres of prime property right on the outskirts of the little town where they settled down. And she doesn't live there anymore. They never built a house on it, but apparently the land itself is now quite valuable. She has since moved into Rotorua, which is a little town there close to in the North Island, close to Auckland. So anyway, that's Denny Hulme's life. In some ways, he was very successful very quickly. He didn't start really getting into Formula One driving until he was in his early 30s, 30, 31, 32. Which in today's world that's very late, but that was the case a lot back then, where a lot of drivers, driving saloon cars, driving sports cars, driving all different kinds of cars, and Formula One was just the next step in their career. I want to thank our sponsors for this section. Our sponsors for this section was Give, Send, Go. Folks, you can't help what happens to you in life. Bad things happen, and sometimes you just need some help getting back on your feet again. But you can choose someone or an entity that can help you get back on your feet, and that is Give, Send, Go. Give, Send, Go is a faith-based, conservative crowdfunding entity that would love to be able to help you, your friends, or whoever, help them through their crowdfunding website. Help you raise the funds to get back on your feet. Or it may be you've come up with a good business idea and you want to raise some funds to help you get the business going. Well, think of Give, Send, Go. That is givesendgo.com. Again, that is givesendgo.com. And we'll be back in a very short while, and we'll do the second portion of this week's podcast, and it will be, as I said, on the history of tires in Formula One. Welcome back to the Formula One News Hour. I'm Jonathan Steele, and let's talk about the evolution of tires. Tires, even from the very early age of Formula One racing, which was, as we know, started in 1947, tires evolved with the cars. And it's interesting to note that it really took quite a few years from the beginnings of tires to really get into the tire that we have today. So in the 1950s, if you were to look at a Formula One car and you looked at the tires, they probably had 22 to 24-inch wheels, and they had these, what we, in today's term, regular narrow tires, just like they were putting onto the street cars. They were cross-ply tires, and of course the problem with cross-ply tires is that when they burst and instantly go flat. There's no in radial tires that we have today. They will, if they get a puncture, they'll go down slowly. But in cross-ply tires, when they got a puncture, they just burst, and that's how a lot of the Formula One drivers at the time lost their lives, is because the tires burst and they'd fly off the track and hit something or something. The other really interesting thing was that they believed in the early part of Formula One history that the tires had to be grooved in order to give them better grip on the track. And while it may be true to a certain extent for the cars at that time, especially when they went round the corner, the pieces of rubber between the grooves, it would allow the rubber to kind of mold more as the wheels leant to one side, just very slightly. You know, you can imagine on the cars, if you look at the camber caster and things like that on the cars, then their theory was probably correct in that the grooves did help them maintain a grip going through the corners. But where it did not help them, the groove tires did not help, was when you were starting from go or you were accelerating hard out of a corner, you had much less rubber on the road. And so that groove tire then became a detriment rather than a help towards helping the car get through the whole race. The other thing was the tires back then. Usually one set of tires would last the entire race. And so you'd put on a set of tires, and the only time you would probably change the tires is if you got a puncture and the tire didn't fly to pieces, but you got a puncture and you managed to make it back round to your pit, and then they would put on another wheel with another tire on it. So you want to think about this. Back then, a typical pit stop to change a tire was anywhere from 60 seconds to a minute and a half. So when drivers came in to get the tires changed, it was really it was really a lot of work. I mean, no more work than it is today, but the way they did it, it was a lot of work. And so they were in the pits for quite a long time, and that went into other things for fueling. Pit stops of minutes was the normal. Nowadays, if a pit stop is more than 6 or 7 seconds, you know, it's a disaster, right? So somebody today gets a 5-second penalty for something they've done wrong out there on the track, and they pull into those pits where they normally expect the car to be stopped for 2.5 seconds. Now it's 7.5 seconds, seems like an eternity. Anyway, back to the tire design. So this whole tire design really went through the 50s. It didn't change that much. They messed with the diameter of the wheels, and they messed with some of the compounds of the tires. So instead of having cotton wrappings when they're first building the tires, they started working with other things like nylon and some of these other materials that were coming about. Remember, the tire, excuse me, the tires were made from whatever whatever materials that were available to them at the time. And it's got to be noted that the rubber back then was much more pure rubber than the rubber on the tires today. So anyway, they went through the 50s and they experimented with diameters a little bit, not so much with the width of the tire. That pretty much remained constant. And you know, a lot of times when you look at those tires, then you would think that really it's the same tire and wheel that they were putting on a car and on a street car. And that's because they really were a lot like those tires. So anyway, as the 50s gave way to the 60s, they were still working, especially in 1960, 61, they were still working on the diameter of the tire and with the grooves in the tire. They were still trying to, optimize that. But as the early 60s came to being, 3, 4, and 5, then what happened was we started to see them experimenting with the width of the tire and the diameter of the tire, and then looking at the difference in sizes of tires between the front wheels and the rear wheels. So they were starting to work with the idea that it was much more important to have a wider tire on the rear to give maximum grip to the engine and the car, and a smaller, narrower tire on the front, because really all the front was doing was taking through the corners. So there was a lot of experiments made with them, but again, they were still staying with the grooved tires, right? So they still had grooves cut into them, like the street tires of today and yesterday. They have grooves in them really for one reason, and that is for when it rains. Other than that, no tire really needs a tread. But the reason our car tires have treads on them is for grip, and the reason the racing car tires had treads on them was for grip. But as they moved into later in the 60s, they started realizing that maybe they could get more grip on the tire if it was smooth, right? So they started experimenting with that. So as the 60s gave way to the 70s, then you could see that the tire had changed dramatically. So the 70s saw the car manufacturers now really working with the tire manufacturers to come up with tires that really were focused entirely on building a faster car with better grips. And so now we start getting into the era of when we might have 2 or 3 different compounds in tires, and depending on the temperatures of the track and things like that, to give the cars the maximum grip for that particular type of track. And so the tires then, as we moved into the 70s, were doing exactly what they were designed to do, and the cars were getting faster and faster and faster. And there was concern then about the cars going so fast and keeping them on the track. And if you remember from my talk on Colin Chapman, this is the time when Colin Chapman developed the ground effects car. So when in the development of the ground effects car, now you've got much more downforce going on those tires. So now the tire manufacturers had to come up with a tire that could not only maintain grip, but also stand the downward force pressures from the ground effects. And remember, when you have that high downforce, then the tires are becoming much hotter. So the tires are very hot, and that heat is transferring into the brakes. So now, as the tires are getting hotter, the brakes are getting hotter. The brakes are becoming less effective. So now we're working on technologies to make the brakes better. If you were to sit in your car and use your brakes really hard for maybe 2 or 3 miles, you're maybe going down a really windy road, and you go really fast and hit the brakes hard, really fast, hit the brakes hard. What would happen over time is the brake fluid would boil. When the brake fluid boils, you'll find your brake pedal will go straight to the floor. Please don't try this, okay? Because it could lead to very serious problems for you. But that is what happens, and used to happen a lot in rallies. In the rally cars, it happened a lot, and also in the saloon car racing, where these guys had to be very careful how they used their brakes. So they got into the habit of what we call pumping the brakes. So you'd you break off, break off, break off, break off. It's kind of something, doing something with your feet, like the ABS systems in your cars do today. So the key here was to, one, keep the wheel turning at a slower speed, because that's when you get maximum braking, but also keep the temperatures of the brake fluid down. So now the tire manufacturers are going through all of this. Well, how do we get the cars to get up to the speeds and keep them on the road and all those kinds of things, and not have the tires blow out and not have things really going really dramatically wrong for them? And so it's during the 70s that we see the radial tire coming into being. The radial tire is what all of your cars are outfitted with today. They probably make old cross-ply tires for vintage cars and stuff like that, so it can maintain the look and the feel and all those other good things. But for the most part today, all of your tires are radial tires. So as radial tires came into being, then the speeds got to be such there was concerns now about the speed. So let's just take a moment and thank another one of our sponsors. We would like to thank CloudHub. Folks, if you want a good alternative to Facebook and some of the other social media sites out there, Truth Social and all these guys, you need to go to CloudHub. CloudHub is a truly social media site that has all kinds of good things. You can start your own channels. You can have all of your own content out there. So instead of going out and trying to create your own Facebook or whatever, you can create it right there in CloudHub. It's a conservative-based entity. There is no censorship. Never has been any censorship. It is the perfect platform for you to communicate with your friends. They've also got a really nice feature now, and that is, if you've got good friends in other parts of the world, you can talk to them in their language. When they hear it, they're hearing it in their language. And when they talk back to you, they're talking to you in their language, and you're hearing it in your language. So lots of really neat things and good things about CloudHub. Go out and give CloudHub a try, folks. You'll find it well worth your while. That's cloudhub.com. Again, cloudhub.com. All right, so as we phase out of the 70s and into the 80s, we start to see in the 70s, in the 80s rather, the really slick tires that have morphed in from the 70s, and you see big differences in the rear wheels and the front wheels, and you'll see even if you get a chance to watch some of those races, you'll see at that time a lot of the manufacturers were having the tire manufacturers build tires to their specific needs. And incidentally, there's only been about 3 or 4 tire manufacturers for the Formula One world. There's Pirelli, which is doing it today. There's Bridgestone, which did it for most of the 70s and the 80s. There's Michelin, and then there was another company called Avon. And of course Dunlop, but really that's about it. Today it's pretty much dominated by Pirelli. Nobody tries competing with them for it. At one time there was competition between the different manufacturers, but for the most part, when the tires were being manufactured, it was being done by one particular entity, maybe 2. So as we get into the 80s, the Formula One powers that be decide that the cars are getting too fast and we got to find a way to slow them down and keep them on the road. And so what did they do? They started putting grooves into the tires. Interesting, right? So the tires, the grooves, the way they cut them, they didn't do that. They actually slowed the cars down. And if you look at the groove tires from the later 80s, and look at the intermediate tires for the wet roads today, you'll find a lot of similarity in those tires. That's why in the intermediate and then the very wet tires, the lap times will go up 5, 6, 7, 8 seconds. So Formula One managed to achieve what they were trying to do, and so they took it down, and they cut those speeds down. As we moved from the 80s and into the 90s, they started in then with the different compound tires: soft compound, hard compound, medium compound, wet tire, intermediate tires. And so what they had the manufacturers do, so that people in the stands, the spectators, and even for the teams themselves would know, and Formula One in particular would know that what tire they were using, based on a color code that they painted into the groove. So when you saw them coming down the track, you saw these like a red groove, or a yellow groove, or a white groove. And so this told the fans, what type of compound tire they were running, but also told the Formula One folks what type of tire they were running. Because the things that Formula One started introducing in the 90s and then into the 2000s was that they said, okay, so we're going to let you have, X number of tires per race. Let's say you can have 3 sets of tires per race. But what we're going to make you do is, if you do the final practice on a soft compound tire, you have to use that same tire to then start the race on. So this really got the strategists really thinking about what they're going to do on the practice session, right? And then what they do for the race, because whatever tire that was, then they had to start the race on that. They've since changed that, so now it's on the free practice 2. Whatever tire they finish free practice 2 on is the tire that they have to start the race on. And then they're allowed 2 more sets of tires, okay? And if they go through more sets of tires than that, well, just tough luck. So the tire technology kept advancing and moving on to what we have today. And it's really, really fascinating to watch the teams, because the strategist now probably is one of the most important people on the Formula One team. Not the driver, not the team principal, not the team engineer, but the team strategist. And of course, in 2022, we really saw that come alive with Ferrari, where the team strategist got it wrong, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, maybe more. And so Ferrari would come out and win pole, but then they'd come in second, third, fourth, whatever. Whereas the team strategist for Red Bull, and she actually won, Hannah Schmidt is her name, she actually won Formula One Engineer of the Year for her strategic moves with the Red Bull team. And so what we have today, we have the same tires. The grooves went away, by the way, in the middle 90s, I'd say. The grooves were gone, and we're back to an all slick tire. But what they did decide to do was keep the color scheming for both Formula One and for the fans, so the fans could understand what tires they were on and why and stuff like that, and figure out, try and play along with the team strategist as they work throughout the race. So now, typically today, you've got red for a hard compound tire, you've got yellow for the medium, and white for the soft compound. You'll usually find most car teams today, they're going to finish on, they're either going to start or finish on the soft, and then depending on which track it is, they're going to move to the intermediate or to the hard compound. And remember, so every time they change tires, then it's about anywhere from a 19 to 22, 23 second reduction in position. So if you're leading the race and the guy behind you is 5 seconds, and the guy behind him is 13 seconds, and the guy, so you get the picture. So when your strategist working out when to change tires, they're figuring out exactly when to come in to give you the ability, or to give the driver the ability then to make up that time again. right? Because you could come in and then get behind one driver or two drivers, and they're in a DRS chain, and you're stuck there, right? It's so difficult to get out from behind them. So the strategist has to figure out exactly to get the timing right, so that you come in and you get your tires changed, and you get back out, and you get out right in the exact position in the track. So to finish up, if as you can see through the pictures that we've included with this podcast, you can see the evolution of the tires from the 50s, through till today. It's an amazing evolution, and it continues to evolve. And remember, everything that they're learning on the Formula One cars goes into building the tires for your street cars. What's really interesting, though, is that your low-profile tires on your street cars actually came about through design work in Formula One cars, but the Formula One cars have never really adopted that really low-profile tire. Of course, part of the reason for that is when a Formula One car gets a puncture, it typically does not just blow out and some. Every now and then you'll see them, because of the temperatures or something like that, you'll see one pop, and the car spins around and maybe spins off the track and stuff. But a lot of the times, if you listen closely, you'll hear the driver tell his team, "I have a puncture," and he keeps going around the track, and he gets off, gets a new set of tires, and gets right back on again. So the blowouts are very rare. But when they do have a blowout, then that's a big learning experience for the tire manufacturers. And that's how, today when you're driving down the highway at 60, 70 miles an hour, and you run over a piece of metal, or you run over a hazard in the road even, and you get your tire actually gets cut and you get a puncture, you don't fly off the road. You can sense straight away. Now you've got your pressure indicators, but you'll feel your car pulling to the left or right. But in the days of cross-ply tires, when those blowouts happen, boom, you just flew off the road, or you flew into another car, or you flew into the center median, because all of a sudden you just could not control your car. So great advances have been made in tire technology, and I would say that a large portion of it is because of the Formula One race. Of course, we've got, as well as Formula One, we have other racing. We've got rally car racing and all that kind of stuff, which also feeds into research and doing it. But I would say, for the most part, Formula One can take credit for making the tires as reliable as they are today. So until next week, let's thank our sponsor for this portion of the Formula One News Hour, and we're going to thank El American. El American is a bilingual TV station out of Florida. When I say TV station, they are an online entity, and they really focus on giving you the news and not opinions. Today, the news is so much opinion and so little news. Well, there's news in there, but the guy giving you the news, or this outfit giving you the news, will look at the news and go, well, that person died by this way. And they'll say, well, that person didn't die by that way, they died by some other way. And they give you their opinion of what they think about how that person died. Whereas in El American, you're getting facts, you're getting real news. You're not getting any embellishments at all. You're getting what is happening, when it's happening, and you're getting it in both English and Spanish. So all of my Spanish Formula One News Hour friends, please go out to El American. That is elamerican.com. Again, elamerican.com for all of your news needs. And finally, for this week, we need to thank our producer and our technical guru, who is kind of making a mockery of me right now, but they are kind of funny. And that's, when I do this, he's putting out a Formula One News Hour blooper. But anyway, we have to thank Andre Kuhn for all his efforts and his hard work. And we'll see you all again next week.